Good morning, everyone. Heartily welcome to this seminar. My name is Kjetil Selvik. I have the pleasure of hosting this event today on a very interesting topic of global concern, which is the crisis or problems of journalism, quality journalism, professional journalism, and the potential role that technology can have in not causing this crisis, which is usually the focus, but potentially also mitigating the crisis. I must inform you that this event is live streamed. So when you raise questions, please introduce yourself with a name and affiliation if possible. We have the pleasure of having Walid Al-Saqaf here today from Södertörn University in Sweden. Now, Walid has a very interesting background because he's both an expert of computer engineering and an ancient journalist who is now an academic working on questions of digital journalism. And he will give an introduction of approximately 40 minutes. And then we have Associate Professor Bente Kalsnes here from the Oslo Metropolitan University who will comment, and we'll leave the floor for questions after that. So please, Walid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kjetil. It's been a great pleasure to be here at this prestigious institute, and I'm really delighted to come to you with something unorthodox, something new. As mentioned earlier, I have a dual hybrid background in computer engineering from the Middle East Technical University, and I'm glad to have one of my alumni colleagues here, His Excellency Mr. Fazli Çorman, who's the ambassador to Norway, as Turkish ambassador. So he knows how prestigious that institute is in terms of giving me the knowledge in technology. But I also have a journalism history as well, because I worked as an editor-in-chief of the Yemen Times in Yemen, my home country, original home country, and then I pursued my higher studies in journalism. So I want to bring these two worlds together. Sometimes it works, sometimes not so. Today I hope to persuade you that there might be some chance of perhaps looking at another technology apart from the internet, which we have seen has influenced journalism in different ways. But I know the topic might appear daunting, especially if you've already started to look into what blockchain is and how it works. Hopefully I'll try to break it down so that it makes more sense. And I'll start with something that you already know. I think you have seen this, some of you have seen this before. This is basically what we now use on a daily basis to communicate. It is called the internet. I mean, this is the visual map of how it looks. It's done by the Internet Mapping Project, the Bell Labs Lumeta Corporation. And it represents not necessarily one platform, but a network. And this is what Manuel Castells is describing the internet as: the network is the message, taken from Marshall McLuhan's popular phrase about the media. And the notion here is that the way this network is designed, it makes it unique, makes it different than what we had in the past, because it has three main characteristics. First, it is global in nature. It defies boundaries. It has nothing to do with national boundaries. You don't have a Swedish internet, a Norwegian internet, a Yemeni internet. I mean, it's a global network. So it means that it defies, or say it transcends borders. And then it has the open architecture. And then when the initiative of the design was put in place and spearheaded by the fathers of the internet, and then the Internet Engineering Task Force, they made sure that the architecture is standard and open, so that the open source standard makes it possible for scientists, for engineers to find interoperability measures and to make it more or less immune from being taken over by one corporation or patents, or etc. So that's very interesting about this technology. And the third one is that it has to be decentralized. So there's no single entity in charge. And so these three characteristics are quite vivid in this picture, which on the one hand represents the globe, open in the nature that it is visible. You can see how the various packets are transferred from one point to the other, and it has no center, no central authority in charge, so it's decentralized. And sometimes I jokingly refer to this as the notion of, it's a bit far-fetched, but it's as a joke. It shows that sometimes you just can't find a way to disrupt this unless you destroy all the nodes or find a way to disfigure the whole system. And that's what caused this revolution from these very old means to something more efficient, faster, more versatile, accessible, and has a global reach and easier to set up now with smartphones available. So the technology is not one that at the beginning appeased governments. It actually disrupted how governments work. It made control very difficult. It made information flow much more seamless and cross-boundary. And instead of fighting the internet, then governments had to find ways of dealing with the internet and working their ways through sometimes cyber laws, other measures, but not being able to take back control. So that's what happened. And so if you think of the internet, you come to a point of decentralization as being one of the main themes, as we noted. And so decentralization means that you can communicate with anyone. You have a friend in China or Russia or in the US, you can easily send them an email, and this email would be routed through the shortest path on the internet. So it means that peer-to-peer, it makes it possible to not use a third party, not use a central authority. So you can have this person on the far left reach another person through the network without having to go to a particular entity that allows it to, I'll say, gatekeeper, that allows it to monitor and so forth. And this made email, for example, possible, because by email you can send from one point to the other without having to use a central authority. But it also made possible to exchange files, such as the uTorrent peer-to-peer network, which allows you to send files and share files. So these are two typical examples. But there is a problem with this if you note, if you want to use a system that relies on not copying, because this is a reflection of how you copy a message. When I send a real post, I don't copy the post, I send the actual post. So I go to the mail, and the post itself leaves my destination and arrives to the other destination. I can use this, for example, to send my passport, send certificates, send something valuable. So whenever you use this on something of value, it fails. So if you send something that you don't want to remain in your side, it's just one copy, it fails because the way it works is that simply it transfers information. It's like copies information, relays the same information, and you have maintain your copy. So this means that this form of network will not work for sending value. By sending value, I mean sending something that it has to disappear from your end when you send it to the other end. And in a day of digital money, for example, digital paintings, digital certificates, you actually need a way to make sure that whenever you send something from your side, it has to disappear. It has to not remain there. For example, if you'd like to sell an original piece of artwork that has been done digitally, you need to find a way to ensure that that no longer exists at your end. The ownership of it moves to another person. And the same applies with certificates, because in an age of digitization, much of the content that we have today will become digital. So the copies that you have, the hard copies, will have to be have some form of digital equivalent. And so this digital equivalent needs to stay as one copy. This one copy needs to move from one person to the other. Ownership moves. How do you do that with the internet? That wasn't possible until the invention of the blockchain. And so what the blockchain does, facilitates, if you want to remember one simple thing, is that it allows the application of the internet as the background, let's say, infrastructure, to transfer value, so that anything of value moves from one node, actually disappears from that aspect, and actually becomes owned by the next node that you're sending to. And so the way that it is done is basically thinking of it as a ledger. You know, when you want to send money, this is a very simple, mundane thing that you think of when you consider value. If you want to send money from one account to the other, what happens usually, in the traditional sense, is that you go to a bank, and in the bank you have a person, accountant, or whoever is in charge of the accounts. And that person would have a ledger. And this ledger would note that, for example, the first day you both opened an account, you had 0 balance. The next day, account A loaded $100 kroners. And then that person, and the third day came and then transferred that 50 of that was transferred to this person. So now you have in the ledger that A has 50 and B has 50. Okay, this is how a ledger works. There is a central authority. You go to it, you record what you want to transfer or you want to deposit, and that person is entrusted. So you may have a third party. This third party is the bank. Actually, if you want to ask or intervene, please do so. You're very welcome to do so. So what happens now is that this bank has become very powerful. It is the person or entity that is in control of the ledger. So there are hypothetical scenarios where the bank can fail, in which case your ledger, the information about what you own is gone. There might be cases of hacking. So your bank can be hacked and the data can be distorted or destroyed. And so there are various scenarios where a single point of failure, being the bank, can lead to catastrophes, disasters. Another thing is that it adds a lot of cost because the bank will have to get its reward somehow. It has to apply fees, it has to apply some form of compensation for its work. So the idea behind the blockchain is that what if we have the ledger, ensure that the ledger exists, but instead of having it at a single entity, why not have the ledger at every single entity? So you can see here, I don't know if this is, yeah. So this is the ledger. So this ledger that used to be at the bank is now moved so that a copy of it exists at every single node who is transacting on the network. So the center is no longer needed because the same ledger, the ledger that is supposed to be authentic and authoritarian, or let's say has the authority to include all the data, now actually exists with every single node on the network, full node on the network. So in this way, you have a method of eliminating the center. And if no question is posed, then I can presume everyone is getting it, hopefully. So, but the thing is that you have to find a way in which every single point agrees that this is the correct ledger. And that's what Bitcoin, through this paper, introduced, which is developed by Satoshi Nakamoto, allegedly a person or a team. And it was introduced with a proof of concept in a paper that said this is possible using a mechanism called mining, in which you mine the currency and you produce it and you prevent the double spend problem, which means that you don't have a single person having the value twice, as we mentioned earlier with content on the internet. And so to do that, it is a rather complex method in which you can do mining. There are various videos on the internet. In fact, I held several workshops for 3 hours simply to explain what mining is. So I don't think we have time for that. But there is a very ingenious method of helping introduce a system, a checks and balances to ensure that the ledger is in fact maintained accurately for all the nodes. And why did this happen? The idea behind it you can actually get inspiration from the first incident of the first block of the blockchain of Bitcoin. The first blockchain put a message. This message, block of the blockchain, put this message, which was about a news article published in January 2009, saying that the chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. So it meant that this actually meant they wanted to disrupt the central control of banks in this concept. It didn't say it explicitly, but you can read in between the lines why they decided this particular entity would be put in place. And this is the actual story. So this has become immoralized in this blockchain. So you cannot remove it anymore. And so what it works is that unlike the central system, which is the centralized form of a network, which is used to be the way that governments would apply for calling international calls, for example, or a bank being able to use itself as a third party to connect nodes. This is the system that has been in place for the internet. So the internet itself meant that you will have smaller nodes and bigger nodes, and this is a hierarchy that exists. So far in the progress of Bitcoin, we have this distributed method, meaning that every single node has a replica of the various, the information or the ledger of the node. So these are the three models. And so far in the Bitcoin network and blockchain, we have this one here. And each one has its various pros and cons, and this one has also its cons. And by the way, when I introduced the topic of blockchain and journalism, I wanted to make sure you get at least a basic idea of what blockchain is, because without that you might not understand why it might be useful. And so it would take time to absorb this information, but yeah, trust me, over time you'll get to know what I mean. So the thing about the blockchain is that because of its design, it has three major characteristics. The first characteristic is distributed, is that it has the same information, let's say ledger, distributed across various nodes. So it means that you need not to trust intermediaries anymore. So you don't have a central authority. And we have established this. The second thing, which is also important to note, is that it is traceable, because what happens on the blockchain is that transactions that are kept on the ledger are maintained. So you can actually go back in time and see various, who sent who, at what time, over time. So you can actually go back and prove provenance. You can verify the transaction's route, what it took to get from point A to point B. And it's also immutable, because what happens here is that since you have, let's say, thousands of nodes, it is not possible to go and alter one without having to alter the history of all the nodes and across the world. So this, when you say immutability, it means it is not possible to change in the past because it's too costly. It requires you to actually change the history of, to take control of all these nodes and then change the history. So it's not 100% bulletproof, but it's much more secure than any system we know of, because it requires that the majority of nodes be hacked. And that's virtually very, if not impossible, very, very, very difficult. So these are three characteristics that this design provides, because of what we have explained earlier. And so, what does this have to do with media and the internet? And that's a legitimate question, because that's what we'll be going next. Because of these characteristics, there are several entities and media corporations that are beginning to shed light on why the blockchain is interesting and important. And these have become a focus on several news corporations such as Forbes and Bloomberg, due to reader interest. So the readers themselves are driving news, as you've noticed in the past. And so the huge hype in the, let's say, cryptocurrency market, the rise of the Bitcoin price, all of these things led to users becoming curious. So now media and journalists are beginning to look into it as well, not necessarily because they love it, but because there is more user interest, reader interest. And then there was a phenomenon. This phenomenon is called initial coin offerings. And these are basically the replication of the Bitcoin blockchain in different names, under different protocols. And that means they'd like to create their own coins. So that means that each Bitcoin has inspired others. Okay, since Bitcoin was created, then it's possible now to create a number of different coins. And these coins ended up having their own what is called initial coin offering, and which is a fundraising campaign. And that has emerged in the connection to media, because there are some that have used this scope of media and journalism to allow them to generate money for them. And a very good example is a social media network that's been successful, and I'll give you some examples later. And there's also been a number of technical groups meeting, that, for example, the IEEE, where I am also a member of one of their committees on blockchain. They have also been working on standards, because for how long can you stay without a standard? So there isn't a competing paradigm. There are competing paradigms, competing interests in making sure that technology continues and becomes more standardized, because otherwise they will create too many standards and not mass adoption will be very difficult. So will there be an opportunity? Like the early internet, there were versions of the internet basically, and then they ended up deciding on taking the TCP/IP standard protocol as their way forward. So right now we are at a very early stage of deciding which standard will succeed. And because it's very early, and it allows more for more risk tolerance. For example, for one, I'm not a really big investor in this field, but I'm a researcher. And so this is a ripe moment for me to see which one of these models or paradigms are useful. And this is very widely reported, and media have now the ability to see to it that they are early, they join early in understanding how this evolution is taking place. Unlike when the internet started, when they didn't really grasp the opportunity to understand what importance it has and how it can change the world as we know it. They came rather late. And so right now it's possible for media to have their own research entities. They have their own observation units to see where this technology can take us. And so these are examples of how one can be involved in this space. And these are the typical examples that I often show of projects that are related to journalism and blockchain. By far the most popular is called Steemit, and it's a social network based on the blockchain. It's similar to Twitter and similar to Facebook in the sense that it allows anyone to join, but remarkably enough, it has no central server. There is really no central server in place. It's all the data that's stored on these on the Steemit network is basically on the nodes of competing nodes, the hard disk of nodes that are joining the Steemit network. But there are also more ambitious projects, very closely connected to journalism. So this is social media in general, but this is purely for journalistic purposes. And it's one I've written a paper on that I'll describe later. And then you have other examples here. These are all trying to find ways in which one can utilize blockchain. There are some that are more less, let's say, successful, but they are still working on producing that. However, I'd like to note here that this is an area where many have died out because it's difficult to understand how the market will react to your ideas. So I would say less than 5% would succeed in this space, optimistically speaking. So when you think of journalism and benefits, you would like to understand how is it that these three characteristics, as we noted, traceability, distribution, and immutability, how are these able to help with journalism, improve journalism? So one important aspect that I put at the very center is combating disinformation. And maybe in the invitation you saw on the website, you noticed that there was a picture with fake news highlighted in the middle. So this is where this comes out as one of the main use cases that I'll go through. But there are also others, such as improving economic viability, incentivizing creating content, data-driven journalism, and something I'm fond of because of my interest in quantitative data analysis. Then you have monetizing content, preserving intellectual property, archiving securely because of the immutability aspect, resisting censorship because there's no place where you can call, let's say, that's controlled by any government, and protecting whistleblowers, and there are some projects in that sense. So you have multiple aspects. You note here the dots, the stars and arcs, and you see that there is a commercial aspect in some of them, and there's an editorial operations in others. And this is where one of the interesting phenomena is happening. You have an increasing number of media, let's say businesses around the world that are accepting crypto payments. And these are mainly predominantly in the Western hemisphere, but there are also some that are emerging in the South America. And you may have heard the news, and even in Venezuela, there's been a very strong interest in Bitcoin and using that to combat the inflation of the local currency there. And so, yeah, there are emerging points here, and this website, I recommend if you want to know which ones are there accepting, you will be surprised at how many there are. But then also there are various news promoters of this field, and there are these magazines are getting more and more publicity. and there are podcasts and there are channels that are gaining momentum. So this is increasingly becoming a journalistic subject. It's no longer a niche subject. And this is a very optimistic view of how the future might look like, because what happens now is that because of the blockchain's ability to be immutable and distributed and open, you can run various operations on the blockchain, and these are called smart contracts. And while it's difficult to explain how it works, but it basically means that whatever rules you take generally with a human being, these rules can be embedded into the blockchain. So it allows you to execute steps. For example, one of the simple contracts that you can consider is an association. Let's say you're trying to bring funds or fundraising for a cause. And so you have a deadline, like a Kickstarter. You're familiar with Kickstarter? Yes? So if you have, let's say, a limit of 1,000 kroners, and you'd like to have people distribute money, send money to Kickstarter until it arrives to 1,000 by this date. If it does, then you would channel it to the beneficiary. But if it doesn't, you send it back. And whom do you entrust in the case of Kickstarter? Kickstarter. So that's where you entrust, because you know they are trustworthy and they take a small fee. But in a blockchain world, you don't trust anyone. You put in a smart contract that basically takes the nodes and calculates through a program when and how these funds were received. And if they are received and fulfill the minimum, which is 1,000, then automatically the script executes itself and sends the money to the beneficiary. If it doesn't arrive, then automatically by the deadline, it sends back the money to those centers. So this is basically a script that you can have on the contract, on the blockchain. And blockchains allow storing smart contracts, such as in the case of a very popular blockchain called Ethereum. And it also allows storing content, general content. So you can store programs. And in this case, the journalistic operations can be, say, reduced tremendously in terms of work operations and costs. And instead of using humans, that means that they'll use machines, making it faster. Automatic remittances of fees, etc. The escrow is not necessary anymore. The expenses on the long run will be much lower. And it's a virtual presence. Everything is digitally signed. And so lawyers would not be necessary because everything is executed based on the code. So various interesting phenomena. And I'm saying this is among those very progressive ways in which media can operate. And they're already beginning to happen. There's advertising is broken, let's fix it. This is the theme of AdBank, which is a startup helping ensure that whatever you get advertising shown, automatically the blockchain would calculate how much money a smart contract would be calculated, and then how much money is owed to who, and that money is automatically sent to the account. So all of this will be executed through smart contracts. The civil space is a very interesting project, and this is one that we've studied deeply, and it helps automate a lot of processes in terms of fact-checking, or checking, let's say, the quality of content. And that means that the nodes of the network, who are actually, in this case, journalists, or newsrooms, will be the ones to decide the fate of a particular newsroom that's violated the terms. And I'll come to that if we have the time. And this is one of the areas that is very interesting. And I say this is more or less 80% of what I'm thinking of using my research in. Authenticating content. And today, in a fake news-filled world, you have various forms of content. In workshops I provide, I often show deep fakes, a phenomenon of videos being portrayed as if they were authentic, but they are actually manipulated. And instead of the real image of the actor, you find Nicolas Cage sometimes, various videos, putting Nicolas Cage's face on that person. And then many get actually fooled by this and think this is authentic. But the problem here is that you can actually utilize artificial intelligence. You can have fact checkers to fact check if this picture is real or not. But how about if we have the original content, the first time it was published, let's say the original video, put on the blockchain. That original video is like marked as this is certified to be authentic, and it was produced by this person on that date, and all the data is available. And then any version that comes later can be cross-compared with the blockchain verified entry. And if it doesn't appear there, then it's not necessarily, it's not authentic. And this is how I think you can mitigate it from the beginning. Instead of fixing it, you can prevent it. And this is, I believe, the next phase where news media will benefit a lot. Not only is it going to be helpful in ensuring that the validity of images and videos are there, but also for text. You can do that for text as well. And this is an example where this can actually protect not only the authenticity, but also the intellectual property. In China, for example, a Supreme Court has issued rules on internet courts allowing the blockchain to be used as evidence that a particular piece of content has once been stored on the blockchain. And so any person who tries to say that's mine needs to counter that argument. And when did you have this? He would give a date, he would give a time, but then you will see that this exists already on the blockchain. And since the blockchain is immutable in the sense that it has been recorded before your time, you can prove that you are the owner of that content. And the same applies here as well. Even in the US, this is being considered. There are some countries that are encouraged by this, including the US, Sweden, Japan, etc., and even Dubai. So there's increasing interest in understanding how you can prove that you are the owner of particular content. And in the case of various means of data journalism, because you are able to track, you can go back in time and see how transactions developed. You can use this to get various interesting stories off the table. For example, this is a story about the ransomware attack called WannaCry. If you've heard of it, it was a major hack of several institutions across the world, leading to billions of dollars in loss. And among the victims were the public health sector in the UK. So this journalist, Keith Collins, had actually developed a tool that allows tracking transactions going to the hacker's account. And this is possible because of traceability. So you can trace back and see which account sent to which address. And so this can be done, for example, to understand how the pizza guy that was sent 10,000 bitcoins today it would amount to well over 30 million US dollars in 2010. Where did that money go? Today, easily you can actually get access to that information. And the same applies to the case where WikiLeaks got a lot of content. So they got funding through Bitcoin because all other channels had been closed for them. So Bitcoin was a way for various people to send money to WikiLeaks, and that is possible to trace as well. You can actually see where this money came from across the globe. And I don't know if we can send these slides to participants. Each one of these actually is a link. So if you click on this in the presentation, you actually see the map and how it's possible to get access to it. And so this is a paper that I've been working on and research. I don't know, I think we're, in terms of time, how are we doing? Okay, we have 7 more minutes. But basically, we have this paper that's coming out this year. I wrote it with my colleague, Malin Edwardson. And the idea behind it is to see if one of the startups that is working on bringing, say, journalists to the blockchain is succeeding or not. And this is called Civil. And Civil is a very sophisticated and difficult to understand project, but it has very big ambitions. We relied in our research and understanding whether this can work, whether it is possible for a journalistic startup that works on the blockchain to arrive to a situation where it can diffuse its technology. And so we argue here through the Rogers theory of diffusion of innovations, if it has relative advantage, compatibility, the complexity and trialability and observability aspects, then it might actually succeed in replacing the centralized newsroom structure. We came to the conclusion that the blockchain technology can be used. It can be a better performer than earlier technologies in terms of facilitating the detection of quality content. And then it still also has the advantage of being not decentralized. You don't have a single gatekeeper, but you have many eyes to look into the content and see where it is held. But of course, it's still new, and so there are aspects of it that are disruptive. there is going to be a power relation struggle, because not many media will agree on letting go of their gatekeeping power. And so there's a conflict between those who are working for the decentralized level playing field for everyone to have same powers, and those who want to have extra powers. And since it's still untested, so far the civil project has not taken off really. It's been lagging behind. But it's still untested. It's still difficult to know exactly how this will be used. In fact, even within, beyond the fintech, which is basically the Bitcoin example here is about fintech, financial tech, sending money, areas beyond money are difficult to prove at this stage. And so we've seen this happen. It's not the first time that traditional media are losing, to technology developing, let's say, industries and users. The various projects that we have, like Facebook and Twitter, have led us to see that, okay, there's competition here. It's not only mass media that will be listened to. And so these are examples of how it works. This is a lot of text. I don't think I'll have to go through it all, but it's just an introduction of how this model works and how it started. And this is another very, I don't want to explain it, but it's a very complicated way in which the civil crypto economics model works. If you want to understand one thing from it, is that it works on the consensus mechanism. There needs to be many people agreeing on things. No single authority, no single gatekeeper. And based on that, it has a rewarding and punishing mechanism. And so if you're really interested in it, I recommend looking into their white paper. It explains how it works. And so we have understood from this that it is possible to have a decentralized system in place. It's possible to have less control of gatekeeping power. But at the same time, decentralization is limited in what you can do in journalism, because journalism is not robotic, it's not mechanized. You cannot eventually let a computer decide on your behalf. So you have to rely on individuals. And individuals, at the very end of the day, are human beings. So what happens, for example, if there's a breach of the system through the council? They have a council with higher powers, but that council is made of individuals. It's not made of computer programs. So we come back to the notion of maybe journalism is not, after all, the area where blockchain technology can apply, which might be a surprising outcome since I've been bragging about blockchain. But it actually has some form of equality distribution. So you have equal distribution of power among various participants to a degree, but not enough to circumvent the council, which is the ultimate power in the civil case. You have transparency endorsed, meaning that you know who's voting for who. And there's a smart contract system in place that makes it easier for you to know the rules have been followed. That's not possible necessarily in a regular newsroom. And the last thing is about accountability. To some degree exists, because there's the risk that the majority will be holding the the possibility that the majority will be able to hold the council to account in case it breaches the trust of members. But it has something very common with many of these, let's say, problems when it comes to blockchain, is that you rely on common sense to prevail at the node's end. If you remember the very first image I've shown about the internet, these nodes are deciding the future of the blockchain. So if the nodes go awry, they go, let's say, mad, or decide on committing suicide, they can destroy the network. But it relies on the assumption that it is impossible for 51% of them going against their own interests. If that group is small, the likelihood is high. But if that group is very big, like in the case of Bitcoin, the likelihood of the majority of them going against the interests of the network is low.
What's the motivation for users to join a network and to be nodes in the system?
Yeah, if they believe in this civil case. Yes, if they believe in the cause. And that's basically why the method of joining is that you have to have a journalistic background, understanding of the need to be a properly qualified journalist. Yes.
Why do that when you...
Excuse me?
have to use the microphone if you want to raise questions.
Sorry, takes a lot of time. I was just wondering why should they do it when they know, following your thing, is that they will use power to technology organization and not, so the journalists will lose power. Why should they then join?
Could you repeat that? I didn't really get
I
it.
see you mentioned before that this development will increase the power of technology making organizations.
Possibly, yes.
And journalists are not there.
Not
so
there.
why should journalists then deliberately lose power by joining this and to build up that organization?
That's a very good point, because Civil is the one that's developing the software. So they are the ones to decide, and journalists don't know what the code is. They don't know how the code is structured. So there is an element of trust involved. So they trust that the coders are going to maintain some form of the main objectives of the network. And they are not going to be buggy codes or, for example, problematic codes and ethical issues. So yeah, there's a trust element involved. So as I mentioned, it's very early. We don't know if it succeeds. Centralization of Civil tokens, that's also related to this, because Civil will have its own cryptocurrency. It's called CVL. Similar to the way Bitcoin operates, they will have their own cryptocurrency inside the Civil network. So they will rely on issuing these tokens as a mechanism of rewarding individuals. But that means that it's subject to the success of Civil itself, whether it will be widely distributed or whether it will be controlled by a small group. That's something we don't know yet, if it will happen. And it also relies on Ethereum, which is the second biggest blockchain, to make it possible for to operate. So if Ethereum fails, everything collapses for the model. They have to find another blockchain to work on. And so this is, I think, one of the final stage of this presentation. And so it's impossible to finish the process from A to Z purely without involvement of humans in this case. Unlike in Bitcoin, where it is possible, because there's no human involvement whatsoever in terms of deciding what takes place. In the case of Civil, there is eventually someone to decide, which is a Civil Council. These are humans. So they end up making a final say on certain things. And that means that full automation is not possible. And because it relies on this Civil Council, which is a group of individuals working to ensure that the system works seamlessly, then that brings the question of, is blockchain the suitable method? Is it actually possible to make it like the ideal method of progress in terms of improving journalism? So there's continued work on this that needs to be assessed. We are trying to see if we can develop a second follow-up story once the Civil really takes off. And so it's still a question if journalism is the area where this technology can be used for changing it, for, let's say, decentralizing it. But that's one question that can be answered in different ways, because Civil is not a representation of all the use cases. It's just one simple case. But we have many other cases, such as verification, authentication, and so sort of provenance verification. So yeah, I mean, so basically that was it from my side. If you'd like to involve in collaboration, that's my email. You can also get my card later. And I hope this was a little bit enlightening for you in the path towards understanding blockchain and journalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Walid. This was certainly enlightening.
Thank you.
You've explained the opportunities and obstacles for using blockchain technology for journalistic purposes. Now, Walid is a member of the advisory board of our research project on journalism in the Arab world, where we're focusing on Lebanon and Tunisia as case studies, and I can assure you the problem of fake news is central. We will now have comments from Bente Kalsnes from Oslo Met. Now, Bente is a scholar of digital journalism and other topics, and she also has her own personal blog, which I highly recommend. because she explains important things related to journalism and media in a very lucid and comprehensible way. So we're looking forward to these comments before we take questions from the audience.
Thank you. And thank you, Walid, for the presentation about a very exciting topic that I must admit I didn't know much about before. I've been studying journalism and political communication and social media for quite some years, and I've also been working as a journalist, and I've also been doing blogging previously. So I've been following the kind of optimism and the more negative developments in the digital spheres for quite a few years. I learned a lot from reading your paper and listening to your presentation, but I have lots of questions.
Of course, yes.
And I think one of my main questions are related to what is the problem of journalism, and what can blockchain address? Because I think in order to address that question, I also think we need to understand journalism and media in context, because media in a Norwegian context is very different from journalism in from your background in Yemen or in the US context. And the problems we have here are very different from what we have in other countries. And one way to solve the problem of trust in Norway would be very different, I guess, compared to, for example, Turkey. So I think when we talk about the problems of journalism, we have to address what kind of political system, what kind of media system, what kind of political culture are we talking about? And I also think that blockchain technology can address some problems in some countries, but to be a universal solution, I think that would be very kind of utopian. And as you explained on some of the last pictures we saw here, it's very complex. It's a very complex system, and the picture you had of the civil and the kind of decision-making process, very complex. So I think there are some important questions to address when we talk about what is the main problem of journalism today. I think that one of the major problems, for example, here has been the business model. But in the Middle East, it might be censorship. And I think we need different kind of approaches, tools to approach those problems. Or it might be archiving problems, that news stories are not archived properly, so it's so easy to erase the history. That was something that was also addressed through civil and blockchain technology. So that could be a way for authoritarian regimes to change the history. So if we start with addressing what is the problem of journalism today, and how can blockchain address that? For example, if we say that the main problem of journalism today is business models, how can blockchain technology address that? If we start out there.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for bringing those up, and you will notice that when you read the civil, and when I read the civil paper, the white paper, it tried to actually sum up civil as the solution to all problems, ranging from the business model to fake news to archiving, various things. So, I mean, it might be really taken to the maximum level of hype you can imagine.
Yeah.
And I think it makes sense if you would like to sell an idea. You would like to try to hit as many targets as possible with just one shot. So if you're interested in archive, oh, we have a solution. If you're interested in fake news, oh, we also have that. So it's like a salesman pitch gone, let's say, to its maximum appeal. But when it comes to the practicalities, and if you notice, it didn't really go as well at the beginning, at least. I don't know how they will develop. And part of it is because it was too difficult to understand. And in fact, they admitted when the ICO failed for Civil that it was just difficult for people to be involved, just to get to grasp how to first buy the tokens, because you needed to go through a long quiz to get to know that you understand the system. But because you don't understand the system, you don't even pass the first stage. So that meant that the majority of those tokens that were sold, they ended up being sold to just one entity, which is the owner of the actual platform. I would say the funder of the actual platform. So that was the complexity aspect. They weren't so. The second thing I believe is problematic is that they wanted to have every single, as I said, every single objective in mind when considering that, not forward to a particular group. And I'd say had they taken an approach of focusing on one area, for example, authentication, like the TruePic project. If TruePic is another project that uses the blockchain to ensure that whenever you take a photograph or a video, that is actually logged onto the blockchain. So at least you get the common understanding of why this is important for me as a person who would like to prove the authenticity of my original content. So that use case is very clear. So yes, you're right. And I admit that when I used Civil as a case, I didn't want to say it will succeed or not. I just wanted to research it. And ironically, my study led to seeing more holes than, promises at the outset. But that doesn't mean that they will fail if they don't adjust their strategy. So the business model is one of those that Civil wanted to address. And by business model, they are meaning the advertising revenue, for example, the structure of the newsroom, because the structure of the newsroom today is centralized. So you have one entity in charge, and that entity is, say, the editors and gatekeepers, and they decide what goes out to the open, to the public. In the case of Civil, there's a consensus mechanism. So if your content is not suitable, then the majority can vote against you, and they will actually take you down if they succeed. So in that way, it promotes a new structure to what a newsroom is. And that would promote, in their argument, the newsworthiness, the value of qualitative value of content. That makes it much more appealing, so that you limit the possibilities of poor content and increases the value which you can sell to a wider audience. You can use subscriptions, you can improve your reputation, and you can sell more and reduce the cost. So that's one of their areas in which they argue for the business model.
Yeah, I find that problematic because it doesn't sound realistic at all. The way I know how newsrooms operate, and also how time-consuming it is if everyone should decide on what is good content, what is bad content. Everyone should read through all the articles and make a decision in common. And I also think one of the premises of Civil and the blockchain technology in journalism, that the intermediaries is problematic. I'm not sure about that. If we say that the intermediaries didn't, if that would be editors. So if you have journalists on one side, and then you have readers or viewers, and then you have the editors. But I think the value of editors or media companies, it can be huge. It can be incredibly valuable. And often what we see in studies of trust is that readers trust a media company more than individual journalists. That's been some of the findings in the Reuters digital news report. So the brand and the company can have a huge value in itself. And also, they might have resources that might be hard for the individual journalists to have, for example, when it comes to lawyers or different kind of protection. So, and the editors or the newsroom as an intermediary entity can also be of huge advantage for the development of journalism. So to say that blockchain can remove the middlemen or the interplayers, I don't necessarily find that a good solution.
That's good. I mean, I actually agree that this is the case where you have the assumption that gatekeeping is driven by business interests. It's not driven by genuine professional. So I think the narrative came when you mentioned earlier the countries based. It's based on where this is applicable. I think the narrative came from the U.S. media structure. So you feel that in the U.S. in particular, there is much more stronger business influence on the media content. In which case, you can actually have a story removed because it doesn't, let's say, appeal to an advertiser or a major political party that they are affiliated to. In which case, this gatekeeping process becomes problematic. And that's why I think you're right in sensing that it's not applicable to all countries. But in one particular scenario where the middleman, or let's say gatekeeper, is abusing power, that's where this might be a better alternative. But it's not uniform, as you said.
And also the whole debate about fake news and disinformation has also been focusing a lot about the gatekeepers, because now we don't have gatekeepers. Now it's so easy to get the information out there. It's so easy to get the rumors, the fake stories, the manipulated stories out there. And it's easier to see the value of gatekeepers. Before it was harder to get information out there. You had to go through an editor, publishing company or a TV channel. But I also think we do see that there is a value by having people who verify, who check the information. There's some kind of control before it gets published. So I think the whole rhetoric about the gatekeepers and how negative it is, I think that's more nuanced these days. So part of the rhetoric around blockchain technology, it's kind of like internet optimism early 2000 in a way, because I think we've seen so many problems of what has happened in the last few years when it comes to manipulating content, actors with bad intentions, using propaganda. So I look upon the whole potential of blockchain as kind of cyber optimism.
I'd like to note that if you take use by use case, then you'd actually split the notion of gatekeeping from authentication.
I agree. Yeah.
Because if you notice that the slides about TruePic, they still require a gatekeeper. Blockchain is not used in that case to remove the gatekeeper. It's just used to facilitate the work of the gatekeeper. In fact, because the gatekeeper's role will be basically to check to see if this content has been on the blockchain. The interesting twist here is that if you actually have a way in which you can verify that the content has already been published on the blockchain, so an immutable record of one piece of content, let's say the Obama video. There's been one of the BuzzFeed videos showing Obama cursing Trump and doing profanity, and that was fake. But if you have a way in which you can check when the original video was put on the blockchain, then this actually could be helpful for the gatekeeper.
Could you explain when you say it's been put on the blockchain?
Oh,
Can
yeah.
you explain?
Yeah, basically what happens is that,
it means?
Let's say you produce a video. This is original video published for the first time. It's conventional ways that you produce it on a website, right? You don't necessarily register it anywhere.
Or on Snapchat.
Like patents. I mean, when you have a patent and you'd like to register it, you usually have an authority where you register it. But for content, you never not necessarily register it somewhere. However, if you have a blockchain, then you can actually have the capacity to say, on this day, by this person, this video was taken, and this is the metadata, location, signature, etc. of this video when it was taken. And you put that on the blockchain as an entry, like you can compare, cross-compare. So several transactions happen over time on the blockchain. So your entry is there, and that's it. You cannot remove it anymore. It's been put on this date on this blockchain, and so that becomes a permanent record.
But if it's been manipulated before it's put on a blockchain?
It has to be put on the blockchain the instant it's published. It's the instant it's created. So that's in the case of the video. Let's say today is a video by Obama, and then the video was shot, and then it's recorded on the blockchain, and then it's public. So it's impossible for someone to go back in time and change it, because the video didn't come out to the public anyway before it was on the blockchain. So the first instant the video was produced is the time it's put on the blockchain. So what usually happens that when the video is out in the public, and then people take that video and then manipulate it. But then they will argue that this is a real video, but then you see the date of the time you've seen the manipulated video is after the date it was recorded on the blockchain. So you can cross-compare and then authenticate and verify that this is actually a fake, because the original was in this format and it was this, and it's different than this video that was produced later.
But if you publish a manipulated video in the first place?
And then put it on the blockchain, you mean?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. The thing is that you have to rely on the authority who published it. You have to sign.
That's the problem.
And blockchain allows you to cryptographically sign with your own private key. So there's a private key, for example, for the White House that can actually prove that the person who signed it is actually the White House. And there's another key for a private person. So they can put as many as they want, but they cannot say that it came from the White House. It can come from a manipulator. They can store it on the blockchain as well. So it's more technical in terms of explaining how cryptography works. But if you have a genuine, original, say, cryptographic key as an entity that's legitimate, you can actually prove that it's you who own that record, and it's you who put it on there. I don't know if it makes it easier, but that's similar to the way patenting. If you think of patenting as a way to do it, it's similar.
But yeah, so if you have bad intentions, if you really want to fool someone, or if you want to produce propaganda, it's not so hard to do it, because then you can create something that is manipulated in some kind of way, and then you can publish it.
Yeah, but you can't prove that you are the person who is in the video. You can't say that I'm Obama, because Obama has his screen and we know he didn't do that. It's similar to the way that Twitter works. If you have, did you see the check sign next to the names of usernames of Twitter saying verified? Tick. So unless you have that tick and you have the name Obama, then you can't actually prove that you are the owner. You are real Obama. So similarly, in the blockchain, you have a way to authenticate. You have that tick in your content, and you say, I am the one who published this. But you can imitate. You can say, I am Obama, and then you publish it under his name, but you don't have that tick next to it on the blockchain. So your entry will be disregarded by the community. They will just see it as a manipulation.
But even though I have lots of questions and I'm quite a bit skeptic about this kind of solution for journalism, I really appreciate that you're thinking hard about this and that you're doing research on this, because I think a problem for a long time has been that we're thinking about ethical issues in the aftermath of starting to use the technology. And some of the developments we see within journalism is that we see more use of artificial intelligence and personalization in the newsroom. But instead of creating filter bubbles, because I think lots of newsrooms are concerned about that. They don't want to create filter bubbles for the users, in the sense that users are only going to see news they like and they normally see. Because of the debates about the filter bubbles, they are trying to develop solutions that are taking those problems into account. So I think it's very important to discuss these ethical and pragmatic parts of the new technology. And I think the question that came earlier about the power of the technology companies, I think that's very important in the sense that we know that the platform or the distributors are becoming so powerful, not the content producers. So yeah, so I think the blockchain technology can become powerful if it becomes popular, and at this point it's not that popular. But to be aware of the power that the newsrooms, the editors are giving away to the technology companies or the programmers, I think that's very important.
Absolutely.
And I agree that I think lots of newsrooms would be reluctant to give that that power away.
Yeah, and I also agree with you on this. We often say that blockchains are a trustless technology. I don't agree with that notion, a trustless. I mean, if you understand the code fully, and if you are approving of the code and seeing that it does what it does, then in which case, okay, I would argue, okay, after this stage you understand that everything else is automated. But then if you don't understand the code, you're trusting the coders that they did the right thing. They did the right algorithm. They have covered all the potential bugs or problematic instructions in the algorithm. So you have an element of trust being, let's say, bypassed by the community. So that's something to consider, yes.
Great, thank you, Bente. We'd like to open the floor for questions from the audience. Maybe I'll start. I'll raise a question myself while you prepare your interventions. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about governments and this technology, because it appears to me that I assume that governments across the world will be a bit skeptical about this technology, because the very fact that it takes away the need for a central authority is not really in government's interest generally. And we have seen in the West that governments are concerned about how Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies are used for money laundering and financing terrorism, these kind of things. But you could also look at authoritarian political contexts and ask to, you know, how will authorities in, for instance, the Arab world where I'm working, look at this? And then the role of intermediaries is often to censor and control this aspect. So, and then there's the question: can this, you know, if all the governments in the world are against this, can this ever succeed? Because you need government support often to get on the wings. I don't know if you have some reflections on that.
Actually, I have reflections from the ground in the Middle East. I did 3 workshops, one in Lebanon and Beirut, one in Amman, and one in Dubai, on the blockchain technology and what it is in terms of internet governance. And at one of my meetings, I actually came to receive the complaint saying, inside, I wouldn't say the name of the person, but he said, if I leave now and try to build my own mine, I will be arrested. And you're talking about blockchain. I mean, there's a bit of the gap between reality and theory. You're saying, yeah, it's an interesting technology. It's possible to help in decentralization, etc., and empowerment. But it's illegal in this particular country. But it's not illegal in another Arab country. So it's too far-fetched for us to take what you tell us and apply it in reality. And so that's a case where I can't do much about it. I mean, governments, because if you don't do mining, which is the process of minting new bitcoins, then you can't participate in the global network in terms of empowering Bitcoin. If you don't have the ability to purchase a cryptocurrency, then you're not going to be part of this network. And the only way in which you can be prevented from mining is to be monitored. And let's say if you have electricity bills and your electricity goes through the roof, then the government would think that's a mining location. So they'd come and seize equipment and arrest you. So as I agree totally. I mean, governments feel this is a threat. And it's a threat. In the past, they saw the internet as somewhat of a threat because it bypassed the international network, say telephony networks power and local network power. But now they see it as a monetary threat because it bypasses the financial institutions. And luckily, say ironically, I was just discussing yesterday, there is this campaign going on now about Bitcoin. It's called the Lightning Network Torch, or Lightning Network Trust Chain Torch. Basically what it means is that you want to use the Bitcoin network to prove that you can remit money instantly with almost zero fees across the world. And so they're doing it from one branch to the other, from one country to the other. I personally have a node for experimental and research purposes, so I can send money. It's a limited amount, not much, but small amounts of money across the world to anyone who has a Bitcoin node. So they wanted to do that for a person in Iran. And that led to a governance problem because Iran is, by the US, under embargo, so it's not legal to send any transaction across the border into Iran. And that applies also to virtual currencies. So that person remained censored. So it didn't really solve the problem. So I come back to the point about governance being one of the main obstacles today.
I will take questions now. Please introduce yourself and use the microphone. Yes.
My name is Willem Baan. I'd like to turn your question and almost put it the other way. I mean, you mentioned with WikiLeaks that one can see probably where they get their information from and who's supporting them. Does that not create ability for governments to crack down, or anyone to crack down on suppliers of information to, for example, WikiLeaks? I mean, this, from my point of view, clearly smaller nations will have a hard time affecting this sort of technology, but large nations, US, Russia, China, EU, if it wants to, can certainly overwhelm this system and create any sort of fake news they want to and control the system.
Actually, you're spot on in terms of being able to use the Bitcoin network's transaction history to identify individuals. And this is what they did in terms of the Silk Road criminal activity that was on the Bitcoin. There has been a lot of criminal activity using Bitcoins, and eventually they ended up tracking the individuals behind this network and eventually arresting the cell that actually used Bitcoin. And so it's, you know, there's two sides to everything. And Bitcoin has this traceability aspect to it that makes it very helpful for governments. In fact, the Russian government has been actually eagerly promoting blockchain. Believe it or not. And they've been, I think they've invited Ethereum founder Vitalik to visit Russia, etc. And so the idea here is that there is a way for governments to trace and track who is using it under the condition that that person is using their original genuine IP address, which is the physical location of the server that you're interacting from. However, now it's like a cat and mouse game. Technologists were able to produce new blockchain cryptocurrencies that can hide that information. For example, they have Monero. Monero is an alternative to Bitcoin, but it doesn't have the characteristics of traceability. So in the case of Bitcoin, it's possible to go back in time and see which wallet sent to which. But in the case of Monero, it's virtually impossible because it relies on a number of other methods of mixing addresses together. They've had a number of different approaches to anonymizing connections. That's what led recently to the unfortunate news story that you may have heard about the kidnapping of a Norwegian, the wife of a Norwegian businessman, I believe. And so they asked not for Bitcoins, but for Monero, because that would leave it possible for them to get away with being traced. So yes and no is my answer, depending on what cryptocurrency you use. But this is a concern. And if I were in the government's shoes, I would also be concerned that cryptocurrencies can be used for bad and as well as for good. I mean, there's always another side to everything.
But a part of my question was also large governments can actually use it to their advantage and overwhelm the system and send out any fake news they want to and hold back, let's call it real news.
Yeah, that's also another. There is this 51% attack possibility. So if any blockchain has 51% of it controlled by a rogue entity, or a government or a group of criminals, then it actually can be taken, hijacked. So the premise here is that for Bitcoin, that would be extremely expensive. I don't know how much in terms of billions of dollars, but it would be a lot of resources being put into it, and so it doesn't, balance out. But in smaller blockchains, the new ones that emerge, it's very simple. I mean, you can pay $100,000 and have some groups take over a blockchain. So that's why their slogan in Bitcoin is power in numbers. So the bigger the network, the more nodes participate, the less likely that any government or any entity can take over. So it's a game of numbers. The bigger the numbers, the less probable it will be taken over. But there's always a risk, yes.
My name is Jens Sandvik. I'm at NUPI. I have one question and one comment. The question is based on your simple model in the beginning, and that is that if everyone who are a member of this network have a ledger, and this ledger should consist of news. If this is generated by the whole community of journalists, that ledger that each one has will be informationally so complex that it must be difficult to handle. So that is kind of question. The comment is rather that I find that the serious question with journalism today, in addition to the economic one, is that you have there has been developed informational cascades where I think it's misleading often to talk about fake news. But more serious is what you can call information cascades. You have a little bit of information, and some people with authority and journalists with some kind of authority confirm that thing, but he or she doesn't have any real information in addition to the one that was in the beginning. And some areas, I have been done research for a long time in corruption, and when it comes to concrete corrupt act, it's very difficult to find out what is the real thing. But it's very easy for people, since this has to do with people's own interest, to impute corruption. So to almost anyone, and no one can disprove. You can't prove, it's difficult to prove, and it's equally difficult to disprove. The same is with this Me Too. Many of these Me Too things have the same informational structure. And sometimes when, for example, the secret police are claiming something, you can't disprove it either. And if you don't trust them, and I don't think it's so good reasons to trust them, you stay there put. And my impression from what you are saying now is, instead of getting a sequential informational cascade, that is a problem, this kind of organization will make it immediate. You will immediately get something without serious informational content that will be accepted by everyone. So that is a kind of problem. So I think it looks like it will reinforce what is a serious problem today.
I get your point, yes. Yeah, I mean, very valid points. In fact, the first question is still a problem. I mean, for example, in the case of Steemit, which is the social network, they were able to store easily on the ledger all the data and compressed format, so that they can actually store as much, because text is easily compressed and reduced in size. The problem comes when you deal with videos and images, in which case they ended up using another technology, which is still relying on the blockchain, but it's much more efficient. So it's not necessarily that you store everything on the blockchain as a copy. It's much more thinking smart and strategic. And how do you, let's say, scale? How do you scale ledgers to accommodate that much text? And how do you, for example, archive parts of there are various technical solutions to this, such as sharding, etc., that deal with blockchain in much more strategic and efficient ways. So that issue of size is still a debate, but they're working on solutions. And the idea of information cascade, I totally agree with you. It's, first of course, blockchain cannot be a solution to every single thing. It can be a solution to specific things, such as, for example, the idea of, similar to patenting, is that you prove an image existed, and this image has been taken at this time by this person. And you can prove that, for example, the police has issued a statement at this time. Then you let it to the audience, to the researchers or investigators, to identify whether that is accurate or not. It's not the role of the blockchain itself to examine whether that information is accurate. But you can't, let's say, deny information that's been stored on the blockchain saying it didn't come from that entity. So it eliminates part of the problem in terms of being accused of forging my statement, for example. Journalists sometimes are told that they are misquoting or taking information out of context. But if you connect it to, okay, you said this and we have proof, you've mentioned this and you said this and released this and this is the time of it. But of course, after a while, you begin to realize that this is not enough. And that's why, for example, projects such as The Correspondent, I think you know about the Dutch news entity that's been funded by our citizens to investigate cases of corruption, cases of... It's impossible to do without these entities. You cannot rely on technology alone. You have to find hard-hitting journalistic missions to get to the bottom of it. And yes, I mean, I don't know if I don't necessarily agree that it will result in more problems than what we have today, but it might lead to more reliance on technology, I would say. Keep on relying, okay, since we have the blockchain solution, we'll just use that, and not to rely on our own, traditional ways of doing things. I would say it should be a supplement and not a replacement of how journalism is done. Yes.
Did you have a comment, Bente?
Yeah, just a short comment. Because the problem of information cascades, we see that all the time, and it's happening particularly on social media. Everything is going so fast, and within a few minutes or hours, a fact is established, even though we don't have the proofs. But something that has been addressed from the media side is how journalists have to make the methods more transparent. They have to explain more why they take the decisions, what kind of information they had, not to necessarily reveal the sources, but explain how they come to the conclusion. But that is something else than deploying new technology. That is more about the methods, and that is more similar to science. We have to explain the methods we used in order to come to a conclusion.
We have a question in the back.
My name is Knut Lundby from the Department of Media and Communication at University of Oslo. Thank you for a very interesting presentation and discussion. And I think we definitely need the editors in journalism. But I then see the resource in this technology for documenting, verifying what has been the original piece out there is an interesting aspect to support the work of editors, and also, of course, being a resource for individuals in social media. And I understand that only those pieces that are put on the blockchain technology could be verified this way. So then comes the question and the challenge to you how to evaluate the coming developments, their piece of art or piece of journalism, whatever, first on blockchain, in order to be able to verify the misuses that may come later. This also should be interesting for copyright institutions, I think, in order to verify who has the copyright. So how do you, both of you develop, evaluate the development, what could happen? Because this is very much about trust from the users on all sides of these technologies.
It's a very good question, and something related to what I've just given a presentation to one IFRA, which is the World Association of Newspapers. In a seminar, I explained to them that you use technology to the best of what you think is useful for you. It's not possible to impose the technology you don't accept. So if you are interested, let's say, in maintaining your presence on the blockchain, you can be a pioneer. You can say every single article that we produce from this day onward will have an entry on the blockchain, the biggest blockchain, which is Bitcoin, for example, and that could be a tradition. So the minute that you produce something, it's just like a experimental thing. It won't cost you much, but it will be leveraged in the case of disputes of copyrights and also protecting your integrity as an institution. But some others disregard it, just like many have disregarded the internet before and said, okay, it's just a hype and it will be over. But over time they realize, okay, they're missing out. So it's a matter of understanding how you can be an early adopter and without taking full risk, because there's always risk. There can be risk in the case of blockchain as well, especially if you're investing, if you are putting a lot of money into it. But I don't see a real threat, unless in the case of the Middle East, blockchains are forbidden, and you cannot use them. That's where we come to the point of gap between the Western world, industrial world, and many of the authoritarian countries. One of them will embrace and maybe be early adopters and use it to protect their rights, etc., and the other part will be left to struggle on its own, and maybe their rights will be less valuable from the global perspective. So these are the gaps that we're trying to work on now. And in my recent visits in the Middle East, I wanted them to be aware of what the world is going through in terms of new technologies. I'm not arguing that they should do it right away, but they can study it. And that's why when I put one of the options is have a small unit in your journalism department, in your editorial department, to look into what is going on in this technology, instead of ignoring it and waking up after 10 years and realizing, oh, we are the last ones to be there. So it's important to have a stake, to think, to argue, instead of disregard and think it's just for, let's say, get-rich-quick schemes. So that's my notion on
Final
this.
comment, Bente?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, Knut, about verification and the need for developing new methods for verification. I think when it comes to, for example, images, videos, it's easier to use technology to verify it, but when you think about how you can manipulate how a situation looked like, for example, in Norway we had this video about Trond Giske. We can say that the video is authentic, but what if they filmed 5 minutes before, 5 minutes after? Because it's also the framing. So we can say, okay, the video in itself is authentic. That's how that situation within like 6-7 seconds looked like. But then we also need to interpret the rest of the situation. I also seen several researchers addressing the need for new methods of verification. And how can we verify something someone said if it's not on record? I think you pointed out a very crucial question for this technology.
Did I overlook a question or come? Yes.
Quickly, a minute each maybe. Or
Yeah, very short, very short. 2 questions. Okay, just...
Mine is super short, so thank you, both of you, all 3 of you, Walid and Bente. Very intriguing questions raised. I'm Kristin Orjare, I'm also from Oslo Met. My question is about when you put something there, and I think, you know, the whole discussion about validity and that you can go back and see that the first source was there, it's true. What if people use this in terms of hate speech, in terms of putting out content that might be true, but we don't want it to be in the public sphere? Is there any possibility of removing content once it's been put there?
Okay.
Hi, my name is Oliver. I'm a student at the University of Oslo. I have a question for Walid. At the beginning of your presentation, you drew a very interesting comparison between the internet and blockchain. My question is related to this comparison as well. So I think when internet first came about, people didn't really take it very seriously, and now internet has becoming very powerful, or way powerful in our lives. That's why governments around the world are trying to regulate the internet. So the question is, do you think blockchain should be regulated as well, and if yes, how? And the second question is, I don't know, is there any possibility for this blockchain technology to break down?
Okay, thank you. Very brief responses.
Very brief. Yeah, for the first point is no, you can't erase anything off the blockchain, and that's, you take it with the good with the bad, and that's why, for example, there was a controversy when pedophile content, links to pedophile content were put. Luckily, it's only the links, so you can actually remove it from the source. But the very fact that you have links to that was problematic. You can do something else called the wallets, or the interface to the blockchain can actually filter out if you decide to filter out content. So you can not necessarily see it on the recipient side, but it still will exist on the blockchain. So unfortunately, that's one of the side case. The case of regulation, I certainly think it's best to have open standards so that the community itself decides how to best use it. And that's what made the internet successful at the beginning, that you didn't let one government or one entity or UN or ITU take over. So well, it's not a big as a problem, I think. Still, the internet is still beneficial as it stands. The minute that you begin to regulate, you have the Russian internet and so forth. That's, I think, more problematic. So I hope that we don't go that direction. Let the scientific and open source community do it. The other point is, what about my view about whether the blockchains system, let's say frameworks, will collapse. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but I assume that it's likely to live with us because it's disruptive, and anything that's disruptive is not easily going to be killed off. It will take its time to mature. It has its ups and downs, but it started. So whoever Satoshi Nakamoto did, he probably will remain in history as someone important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been really enlightening. Thank you for being here both, and for the audience. I hope you learned something. We have brought you a little bit of tea, so please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you.